Hello. So, answering the first question, we are asked to reflect on this quote and the relationship between Latin America and Europe/US. And so, basically, between this relationship, the region's wealth doesn't build its own prosperity. It fuels the prosperity of foreign powers and leaves Latin America poor. Now, Latin America is so important because we are able to extract gold, oil, food, and labor. And these are usually extracted and transformed into wealth for these foreign powers. Now, an interesting concept here would be the native overseers. Now, these people belong to these countries in Latin America and yet profit from the system, which is kind of an idiotic concept because basically these people are benefiting personally and yet leaving their own country poor. Well, I guess. And so this is also important because the US and Europe cannot always directly take these resources, which is why they partner with these native overseers, which are usually people who own land, factories, or government. And so they partner with them and are both able, the US is able to extract the resources and both financially benefit from this. Now, following in with my examples, the first example I want to provide is Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is very popular, has been very popular recently. One, because the president was kidnapped, but second, because Venezuela is known for having the world's largest known oil reserves. Now, because this is such a need constantly in this world, after extracting, this leads Venezuela to have an economic collapse and poverty for most Venezuelans, while foreign powers and corrupt elites profit from this. Now, another example of this terrible system would be Brazil. Brazilian soy, and agriculture are vital to the world's food supply. Now, it's so important because Brazil has the world's largest producer and exporter of soybeans. So, on top of it being such a need in the world, this heavily influences international prices. Now, this massive agricultural export generates wealth for multinational agribusinesses and large landowners. While small farmers are displaced, farmers' forests are destroyed, and the food supply, the food insecurity persists. And morally, these examples demonstrate the resources extracted benefiting external powers and local elites, while the broader population, like Latin America, bears the cost. Right. So, answering the second part of Open Veins of Latin America, the first question we're asked is, what is Galeano's connection between the U.S., the economy, and fertility? Now, throughout this chapter, Galeano argues that the U.S. and other dominant powers looked at Latin America's fertility as the economic threat. That the more people that were being born meant the more resources that were needed for these people. And by using this population control issue, it became a tool to maintain that dependency chain. Now, this basically kept Latin America supplying cheap labor and raw materials while also continuing to stay underdeveloped. Now, when it came to doing outside research to why the U.S. sterilized these Black, Indigenous, and Latin women, I looked at eugenics. Now, eugenics is the scientifically immoral theory that focused on racial improvement and planned breeding. Now, this gained popularity in the early 20th century and basically was rooted in the beliefs that these women were unfit and should be limited. Another reason I had looked was the political suppression, which basically meant the more people meant the more communities that were growing and organizing against this systematic oppression, which wouldn't be good on the U.S.'s part. Another reason would be the racism and social engineering. Now, authorities deemed these women to be socially inadequate, that sterilizing them without the consent was the U.S.'s way of breeding out poverty and decreasing the population for social defects. Now, on to the third part. How do you think this is connected to ideas of development and progress? Now, these sterilization campaigns showed how development and progress had been weaponized as colonial concepts, and that the idea of progress meant eliminating certain populations for colonial interests. and that development was based on Western standards and like excluded marginalized communities. And now when it came to development was measured in income. So it was the total wealth divided by population. And if the wealthy didn't want to contribute to the total wealth for the poor, then that meant that the population would need to decrease to actually show progress. But if the US really wanted to show progress or development, I think they should have focused on reproductive justice than on this political control, the population control. So that's the second part. All right, for the third part, it asks, please explain why Galeano uses the idea of open veins to describe Latin America. And I think Galeano uses open veins in such a beautiful term because Latin America is like a full body, and within a human body, you have veins that keep you alive. And then these veins are like the resources that Latin America has. Latin America has gold, silver, oil, iron, coffee, and more. And these things are being extracted. These veins are being cut open for the use of foreign powers. And when these veins are being cut open, you bleed out and you die. And that's basically what's happened to Latin America. Latin America is just killing themselves for these foreign powers. And on to the second part where it says, what called your attention in the introduction of this book? I love the honesty throughout this book. I think that this book like reflected so much that but we aren't taught going to school. And one line was that Latin America's backwardness and poverty are merely the result of its failures. We lost and others won, but the winners happen to have won thanks to our losing. And I think that's so important because we are taught that like the US has so many good things and everything, but we are the bullies. Like we take from other people and we don't realize the lives that it costs and like the places we're ruining, and like we're extracting so many resources from other people because we're the bullies and we can do that. And I guess it's like we can talk so much about wanting to like be better and everything, but it doesn't really do anything because we stand behind the bullies. We can confidently say all this stuff, but we are the bullies, you know? And so this causes so much like hatred and everything. And I think there's so much honesty in that line and throughout this chapter that I really liked. All right, so for the fourth part, we are asked to watch this movie and then answer, what do you think of the idea that Jesuits have civilized Guarani people by making them sing religious songs and playing the violin? Now, I think this was just an abuse of power, honestly. And throughout the film, this is demonstrated. And throughout this film demonstrated cultural imperialism, where the mission was to create this sanctuary that goes against slavery, but in a way was slavery itself, because in order to be civilized, it was completely up to the European, and so that they had no power once again. And you know, these Guarani people, they meet these fathers who play their instruments beautifully, and their worlds are completely changed. I mean, they turned into something that was unnatural to them. They had lived this way for generations, and here comes these people who completely changed that. And the music played once again beautiful, but it displayed a benchmark for humanity along with the religion, and basically showed that the Guarani's social structures and spiritualities were wrong, and those were animal-like and just unnatural. And so now when it asks us, is it fair that the Europeans say who is or isn't civilized? Well, of course it's not fair, but that's just their abuse of power, you know. Europeans continuously want more, and they want more power once again, but there's not much you can do about that. Like, there's no way the Guarani people were able to fight for themselves, because they had clearly lost throughout the movie. And so I think the whole entire film is basically a demonstration of abuse of power and a territorial issue, because people, like the Europeans, had so much and continuously wanted more. There was always a need for more, which is stupid. All right, so the fifth question asks, why was Portugal so interested in eradicating Jesuit settlements in this part of the Americas? And I guess this was driven by the Treaty of Madrid and the desire for total territorial and economic control. And the Portuguese wanted to eliminate the mission because the Jesuits were protecting these indigenous groups from being enslaved and exploited. And the whole point of the mission was to create a community of indigenous people who worked together, who converted to Christianity, and that were protected from Portuguese slave traders or settlers. But from the Portugal's perspective, they saw the settlement as an interference towards their economic goals. Now, Portuguese colonists, they wanted land, they wanted labor, and they wanted profit. And the Jesuits stood in the way of that by limiting access to indigenous labor. So, Portugal saw this mission as an obstacle to colonial expansion and wealth. Now, for the second question, does economic interest justify dehumanizing other people? Well, of course not. But similar to the introduction chapter we had to read, the author exemplifies powerful countries use economics as an excuse to do terrible things. Like in the movie, in the end, where the Guaranis people were all killed and the little boy ended up surviving, you could see how it divided people and it creates hatred. Dehumanizing other people, there's no way to justify that. It just creates hatred and division. That boy is going to grow up with hatred, and that doesn't solve anything. It doesn't create a solution to anything. And I think with the economic interest, I think there was a better approach than just to dehumanize other people and consider them animals. Alright, for the sixth question, we're asked, who was Franz Boas and what he discovered when living in the Arctic about non-Western communities? Now, Franz Boas was born in Germany and raised in a Jewish family, and was educated within a German university system. And at the age of 25, he had gotten on the ship Germania and traveled to Baffin Islands, where he studied Inuit populations. Now, he didn't study them far away. He actually got to learn the language and their way of life, and he learned that non-Western cultures weren't less advanced, just different, and that the Inuits had a smart, complex approach to life that was based on their environment, and was basically able to conclude that education and civilization was merely based on time, place, and context. Alright, the seventh question is asking, why do you think the example conversation of the museum is relevant to understand Boas' approach to recognize the individual's collective cultural bias that we may have about other people and culture? Now, prior to Boas, many museums often displayed objects from different cultures, from a more primitive state to a more advanced one, with Western more being an advanced kind of culture. Now, it made it seem like non-Western cultures were just less developed. And Boas' approach basically challenges, and he believed the object should be understood by the culture that it originated from, not by the Western standards. By changing how museums displayed these objects, it showed that how each culture has its own logic and history. Now, you could have a European suit displayed, and you could have an Inuit's fur coat displayed, and one would be considered more advanced and one wouldn't. And that's morally on the culture that we come from. And I know the story uses an example like bone rattles, and how bone rattles were used to summon rain, to scare snakes, or to comfort a child. And I think there isn't one that's better than the other, or one that's more useful than the other. It's just on the history of other people's cultures. And I think that's important to emphasize, that we assume what is advanced from our past and from our understanding, but our understanding is very different from other people's understanding. And right, so the eighth question asks, what does Boas conclude when asked to study the physical characteristics of Eastern and South Europe migrants in the U.S. by the U.S. government? Now, Boas was asked by the government to study these immigrants in the early 1900s, and the government believed that intelligence had to do with the shape of people's heads, and that this could permanently prove that some groups were naturally more superior than others. And Boas ended up finding out that the appearance of people didn't actually have anything to do with one being superior than the other. It actually had to do with the environment that people had grown into. Parents who were born in Europe had a completely different body measurements from their children who were born in the U.S. And I think that human biology is flexible, and basically it was influenced by nutrition and their living conditions. And when it comes to the second question, do you think race is a social construct? Well, I would say yes. I mean, I think race is determined by historical, political, and cultural ideas. I mean, we're all so much more similar than one would actually think. I mean, we all bleed the same blood, and it's all up to stereotypes that we create for ourselves. And if race was more like a constant thing, it wouldn't continuously change. Everybody would think it would be one strict definition. But in the U.S., we assume race is based on ancestry. In Brazil, it's based off your skin color and in your appearance. And so I think it's changeable, and I just think that makes it a social construct. Now, if I was to present this to somebody who believed the opposite, I would clearly just state the facts. I mean, skin color is often determined by people who spend a lot of time in the sun. That creates a more darker appearance, and people with whiter complexion usually are out of the sun. And when it comes to races again and it being able to change, I mean, Italians and Jews were once considered the same race, but now not so much. So now you're just changing the definition, and it's basically based on what we believe to be is right, which doesn't really make sense. How that isn't a constant. It isn't one whole definition. It's constantly changing through the culture, I guess. All right, so the last question is, why does Boas argue that Black people in the U.S. have been treated and studied as Nazis treated and studied Jews? Now, Boas uses this comparison to criticize the idea of scientific racism because, once again, people in power wanted to use science to justify discrimination. I mean, Jews were studied and were measured to show that they were biologically inferior. And Boas argues that by studying Black Americans, it was used to just prove hierarchy, not even to understand the human diversity. And that what he was doing wasn't real science, it was just a bias that was presented as science to support inequality. So